Well, one of the areas that I research and teach on is gender, and particularly the relationship between gender and conflict. And this year, for the first time, we piloted a teaching session for all of our first-year undergraduates and all of our master's students on gender. We spent an entire day thinking about it, discussing it and looking at its practical applications. One of the reasons we did this was because there was a demand from students who felt that this was a very, very important area related to peace studies and conflict resolution, and that we perhaps weren't teaching it as well as we might. And I and other staff members actually agreed we needed to really get right back to brass tacks with the question of gender. And one of the things we discovered is that gender has become a word in the firmament. It's used in the media, it's used in academia, it's used in policy circles, but it's amazing how many people actually don't understand what it means. So perhaps it's useful to start with, so what do people think it is that it actually isn't? So gender, first of all, isn't the same, isn't a code word for women. It isn't a code word for women's issues, discrimination against women, questions of sexuality, reproduction. It may encompass those things, but that's not what gender actually means. And a lot of people were coming saying, well, I don't see why gender is relevant to me because I'm a man, right? Okay, so let's start right from brass tacks. What is gender? It's about how we all learn to be men and women in human society, in the human society in which we live. That's the bedrock of what gender is about. It's not the same as biological sex, it's not the same as sexual preference or sexual desire, although it is linked to those two things. It is about the social roles that we learn and we perform throughout our lives, and they can be very complex and changing social roles. And that was really what I wanted to get across in this day. Now, why is that relevant to peace studies? Ultimately, conflict is something social. It's about differences in opinion, it's about differential access to power, differential access to resources, and conflict is something that's absolutely social. It occurs between two individuals, or between groups of individuals, or between states, but states are not sort of some sort of crazy abstract thing out there that exists on its own. States are entities that are run by people with interests and so on and so forth. So if we take the basic notion that sociology and social relations are absolutely key to understanding conflict, one of the bedrocks of social identity is gender. We might say, okay, well, so is race, so is ethnicity, religious identity, class, all those things are too. So you can't just separate out gender from those and not consider it. But I think, and people may disagree, but I think that gender is actually more fundamental and precedes all of those other forms of social identity. Why? Because it affects you even before you're born. Amartya Sen, for example, has calculated that there's something like 100 million women missing in the world, and that deficit is caused by selective abortion of female fetuses before birth, female infanticide, and systemic discrimination against girl children throughout the world, which means that there are some 100 million women missing who would be alive were it not for systemic discrimination. So even before you're born, expectations about your social value and your social role are being played out. Extraordinary. So that's what I think, that gender is one of the most fundamental elements of human identity, and therefore you can't ignore it if you're trying to think about how people act, how people get into conflicts, the kinds of social cohesion that can occur or be absent in human societies. So that's my point about gender. And one of the students did say, what's the big deal about gender? That's the big deal about gender. If you cannot see gender, you cannot see a huge chunk of what makes people tick and what makes societies tick. Yeah? And if you don't get that, you won't understand why we make the kinds of decisions that we do in life that generate or don't generate conflict. Men are absolutely crucial to, first of all, thinking about gender, and also to tackling the kinds of inequalities and discrimination that ensue from gender roles around the world. First of all, men tend to think of themselves as not gendered, as not having a social identity in the way that women have, for at least for the last sort of 40 years, become more and more aware because of feminism about the kinds of social roles that are imposed upon them by society, and some of which, of course, they've questioned. And this always happened when you are the dominant group, or you are the sort of the social norm in society. You tend not to think of yourself in kind of critical terms. But of course, all men learn a certain form of masculinity, or they learn to transit between different forms of masculinities, in the same way that women, learn to deal with femininities, to pick and choose what kind of woman do I want to be. Men, of course, go through that process of thinking, what kind of chap do I want to be? Who are my male role models? What does masculinity mean to me? But often that becomes kind of pushed into the background, whereas women tend to be, in some ways, because of systemic discrimination against women, a lot more sort of thoughtful or critical of the social roles. So the first stage is for men to be able to talk about their own experience of masculinity, which is not always a happy one. So the first step is for men to see themselves as gendered, as people who are expected to behave in certain ways. So, for example, if you were to look at what is now a very common phenomenon in warfare, particularly in civil conflicts around the world, which is the systemic use of rape, principally against women. But the reason that women are raped is not specifically to punish those women. It's often to undermine the social fabric, and particularly to undermine the notions of honour and masculinity held by the men in those societies. So I think what we've sort of missed a little bit is how we deal with, if you like, the secondary victims, because the primary victims are always the women who've been mutilated and raped. But the point is that the men in their society are also destroyed. If they weren't destroyed, if their primary good, masculine good in that society, which is honour, family honour, was not destroyed, what would be the point? What would be the point in raping women if it didn't bother the men, right? So somehow we've got to kind of get beyond simply seeing women as victims, and it is extremely important that we do. I mean, the first position that we've gone through is saying, no, wait a minute, rape is actually an act of war, and it's a very effective one. But then looking at how the social fabric is held together, not just by women and notions of femininity, but men and notions of masculinity. And I think there has been a tendency, first of all, to say, oh, well, gender is just a feminist thing. It's not about men, it's about women. But no, it is actually about men as well. The very first step is to be able to see gender, to see gender roles in society. And gender roles are universally present. There is no human society in which there are no gender roles. But from human society to human society, those gender roles are not universally the same. They vary. So the first step is see gender. Once you can see the different social roles that men and women are taking on, the next step is to then think, how is power distributed along gender lines in that society? And I think it's very, very important, first of all, from a peace studies point of view, that we take a position that says we believe that all human beings are equal and have equal dignity and equal worth. If we hold that position, and if we think that all people should be able to have a say in the running of their own society, then the next stage, logically, is that you invite people within a given society to discuss the gender roles that they occupy and discuss what that means for distribution of power and resources. Power and inequality are omnipresent as well. So you've got to deal with it at some point. So let's think of this as a two-stage journey. First of all, that you get gender, that you see it in yourself and in society, and you also manage to see masculinities as well as femininities. And then you look at the very, very difficult question of then how you have discussions about power and inequality based around gender roles. So in a way, it's an invitation to kind of really engage with gender on a very different level and be a bit more open-minded, but also see it as a hugely important motor in human societies that it is.